Continue now to the second half of our program. Our first speaker from Germany is Peter Töpfer. He is a post-philosophical writer and videographer. And he's just published a brand new book called Pan-Agnostic for an atheist-agnostic alliance against the Great Reset and Transhumanism. And his topic for his talk now is chaos, corruption, deep corruption, and the extension of the domain of struggle.
Hello. Historical events can be the result of effects emanating from fairly unified forces. Then peoples or large social groups stand relatively united behind an action. But that's actually not the rule. Even in a dictatorship that is tightly run from above, different forces can be in competition with each other that the dictator does not really have under control. With regard to the Third Reich, for example, one speaks of an anarchy of offices. But even below the offices, groups there worked against each other as well as with each other upwards against the regime. Hitler certainly did not have all this under control. And even if the competition of subordinate leaders may have been in his interest as supreme commander, the so-called playing off of actors against each other and the balancing of their interests, that did not have to be the case at all. Forces that were clearly working covertly against him should not even be mentioned here, although they were very relevant or even decisive. As another example of a contradictory and even chaotic situation of forces, I would like to cite the situation in Iran around the so-called Holocaust Conference, which took place in Tehran in December 2006, and which I attended with a speech entitled Save the West. By the way, that call remained unheeded. Back then, I was considered to be a Nazi. But nowadays, all opponents are Nazis, and the West probably can't be saved anymore. Even in the immediate run-up to this conference in Tehran, it was not clear whether it would actually take place at all, although it had been announced. The Iranian embassy in Berlin was suspicious and not helpful. Finally, arriving in Tehran, one saw how different forces were working against each other, even within the Iranian leadership. That the conference would take place was still on the razor's edge until shortly before it began. In the end, the group around President Ahmadinejad prevailed over those who did not want to jeopardize a certain relationship with the West. Different, actually mutually contradictory interests do not only exist on a social level, they can also go right through individual personalities. In psychology, one speaks of personality parts, a useful concept. An actor may be torn between different positions and group affiliations. We also are currently facing a chaotic situation of forces, both with regard to the general development towards a technocracy and the prevention of such a development, as well as with regard to the entire geopolitics and a section of it, the war in Ukraine. Edward Slavsquat, in a recent article linked in the description, pointed out how in Russia there is a debate about a certain chaotic situation and about who is actually responsible for the strategic planning of the military operation, and thus who is on which side anyway. The unclear situation in which forces that supposedly belong to a camp but are in fact not acting for this camp implicates that the war in the Ukraine will probably, as Edward Slavsquat writes, drag on for a long time. This stalemate is at the expense of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, both of whom, with their tens of thousands of dead, are the ones who suffer. But it is also at the expense of all other European peoples. The beneficiaries of the ongoing war are forces from outside the European area, but the beneficiaries also include Europeans, Russians and Ukrainians, who have common, at least partly overlapping interests with the non-European beneficiaries, or are even in cahoots with them. For the mass majority of these European beneficiaries, the situation is clear. They have virtually no patriotic or libertarian personality parts related to Europe. In the individual personalities that are considered patriotic, various interests can, in the chaotic situation of forces, pass right through them, even those in the very highest ranks. Then they are not 100% behind the interests of the people, but also act to the damage of the people. Nevertheless, there may also be authentically patriotic parts within such a leader, only he is no longer fully aligned with the interests of the popular masses who are most affected by war. In these personalities, other parts oppose the patriotic parts. However, anti-people personality parts are often also the result of corruption. The phenomenon of the different personality parts and of the ambiguity of the interests of the individual personalities, of course, refers also to the general development towards technocracy and transhumanism. In this development, freedom, personal responsibility, and self-determination of individuals and of the collectives formed by them will fall by the wayside. The cause of the anti-parts does not lie in the affiliation, but rather in the involvement of the personalities in the corrupt structures operated and financed by enemies of the people and freedom. The personalities may also be intimidated, panic-stricken, perhaps blackmailed. The personalities may also simply be corrupted by material things, but they can also be mentally corrupted by vanities that go far beyond a normal need for recognition. The strongest means of corruption, however, seems to be the drug opium. People cling to very obvious illusions because they cannot stand the scale of the catastrophe and do not want to admit it. Corruption always refers to needs that are not among the most important needs. If we take as our deepest need to want to live in peace, freedom, self-determination, and balance with ourselves and our environment. However, this deep need is often overlaid by superficial needs, which the corruption can address. Because the deep needs are often hardly pronounced anymore, corruption not only has an easy game, but one can speak of a state of general corruptibility, which even appears as completely normal and is habit. We are dealing with such a state of affairs above all in relation to that development towards technocracy and transhumanism. And there it concerns not only the governors and the traitors originating from the people, but large sections of the people themselves. Here it even seems that often the promises of the technocrats fall on wide open ears. Technocracy is then only the consequence of a development of mechanization that has been going on for thousands of years. When the plans and tools of the technocrats encounter needs of the people that are no longer rooted in depth, we must speak of deep corruption. Of course, leaders are also affected by this. But we must unfortunately go further and say that deep corruption is not operated and financed by enemies of the people and freedom, but that the people corrupts itself. Namely, it pays itself in the form of conveniences and false peace. Deep corruption is the most important aspect when it comes to submitting to or resisting technocracy. Over thousands of years, needs have been flattened, Now, the citizen is happy that he can pay without cash because counting coins is too difficult for him. Thoughts of any control are not part of his world. The more superficial and inessential the remaining needs are, the more deeply corrupted man is. But depth and superficiality are just different terms for liveliness and non-liveliness. Lucien Cerise has recently, in an article against the end of meaning, pointed out, link in the description, that the essence of the technocratic transhumanist agenda is to exchange life with non-life and replace it with artificiality. The goal of resistance against technocracy is therefore primarily the preservation of vitality. For this reason, even the resistance itself, vitality must be the focus. To mark and emphasize facticity and the importance of living needs, as well as to characterize the more efficient preservation of vitality, Lucien Cerise introduces the term conservative materialism. The term materialism is somewhat unfortunate, and unlike Lucien, for me, feelings are not something unconscious because they are not expressed by words. I nevertheless know them very well. For me, feelings are not a priori irrational either. They only become irrational and chaotic when they are no longer conscious. Otherwise, all needs, including emotional ones, follow a fairly clear, predictable, and straight path to their satisfaction. That is, they are rational. But we should definitely not engage in philosophical hair-splitting here. It should be clear to everyone what Lucien Cerise is about with this term materialism and how new, useful, and important his advance is. According to Lucien, philosophical idealism and the mere recourse to spirituality would not only be insufficient as weapons against technocracy, but would even coincide to a considerable extent with the agenda of the transhumanists, namely in the fact that the transhumanists envisage for us a purely spiritual existence, freed from everything material, that is, everything living. Our existence will indeed, if the transhumanists have their way, consist only of a chip with our mere information, that is, pure spirituality. And here, once again, the agenda of the transhumanists coincides with the anti-freedom personality parts and the superficial needs of large parts of humanity. We are now to be freed and redeemed from materiality, and thus from our aliveness, an ancient Gnostic and Kabbalistic program, Tikkun Olam, of which the realization is now finally to be progressed. Large parts of the people, as well as their own and foreign elites, saw nothing in physicality and aliveness but suffering and misery, and not the source of joie de vivre, affirmation of life, and meaningfulness. In the aforementioned partial correspondence of sole recourse to idealism and spirituality with the transhumanist agenda lies, as harsh as it may unfortunately sound, ultimately the deepest of the deep corruptions and of our end. In order to achieve our goal, the prevention of UN Agenda 21 and 2030, we should not only continue providing information and education regarding what this agenda actually means for people who do not want to become post-humans, but we must also try to mobilize the will to be alive and to preserve it, and to appeal to consciousness to follow the deeper living and existential needs, so that deep corruption comes to nothing. This appeal is identical to the appeal to what is sacred to man. And I certainly join those who call the deep corrupter Satan. But the sacred can have quite different guises, as I pointed out in my discussion of Alexander Dugin. Link in the description. The sacred is basically what is most alive in human being. I come to it. Yes? We should consider that not only re-Christianization, but also addressing and mobilizing the agnostic sections of the population can be used to strengthen the fight against technocracy. In other words, we should address the human beings who still want to be alive, not only on the spiritual and symbolic level, which undoubtedly can be very alive, but also on the material and emotional level. This could be another weapon against the deep corruption, as well as the expansion of our recipients and their mobilization. Turning to the non-symbolic and more sensual material perception could also contribute to a reduction of the chaos and a separation of the wheat from the chaff, that is, to a clearer identification of friend and foe. This turn would, to a certain extent, be a complement to the accentuated spiritual and transcendental approach so far. For the purpose of the alliance of theists and agnostics that I consider necessary, I have written the book Pan-Agnostics. For a theistic and agnostic alliance in the fight against the Great Reset and transhumanism, which just had been published. Thank you very much.